These darn kids, with their jazz records, late nights, and suspiciously well hidden soda shops. And now the women want leisure time and are showing their ankles. But don't worry, it's just a phase. Nothing historically significant happening here at all.
You're listening to History Unscripted with Gabriel and Carl.
Welcome back, everybody. It's been a little bit. We took a break for Easter, and we hope all of our listeners had a awesome Easter. He is risen. He is risen indeed. But we are here now to discuss the Roaring Twenties. And I don't think there is any period in history, in American history, not that is like a war that is more interesting than the Roaring Twenties. Carl, would you disagree, or would you agree or disagree with that statement?
I would generally agree with it. Uh, just how it was sandwiched between those two really dark periods in our history.
Hmm.
And then you have this 9 year stretch where it's just shines extremely bright
Hmm.
is very interesting.
Yes, yes. It's not that everything was perfect in the United States at all, but it's just kind of like an explosion. And it's like if you look at the historical record, for lack of a better term, it feels like kind of an explosion in American history. You know, you go from like the Industrial Revolution, and you have some really important inventions, of course, and then we go up through the early 1900s, and there's just nothing kind of, I'm a history teacher, and even teaching that part of history isn't super exciting. Like we learn about the Spanish American War. We learn again about the Industrial Revolution, and of course we talk about things like child labor and how the other half lives, and kind of this gilded age in America where it's really shiny on the outside, but it's not so great on the inside. But then you hit World War One, which is obviously very fascinating, and then it's like bam, like Roaring Twenties, and next thing you know, American culture is truly being changed. And to me, it does feel like it's kind of overnight. So that's what I love about it. So Carl, let's just jump right in. So how does the Roaring Twenties start?
So I just want to set it up a little bit by just kind of chronologically saying what we just came out of at
Okay.
that time, with it being World War One. Because you just sometimes you have to know how bad it was to really know how good it was and how good it seemed like.
Okay.
Like we had already mentioned, just coming out of World War One, we were only in World War One for about 9 months, but in those 9 months, about 116,000 Americans were killed.
Yeah.
Um, Called the Great War, the war to end all wars.
Hmm.
Um, and even before that, the Civil War was only about 50, 60 years before that.
Hmm.
Um, and so even though may have seemed like a long time ago, you can you can bet that there was still division caused from that. I mean, we see it today, even in with much, much smaller inconveniences like churches and schools having to combine. There's
Hmm.
still people that are like, oh, I'll never support that school. Because they swallowed up my school and
Hmm.
stuff like that. Um, but then World War One happens, and everyone's coming back, and for the first time in a long time, the American people actually cooperated like a true nation
Okay.
for the first time in a very long time.
You're saying kind of since the division of the Civil War,
Yeah,
you have do you have this, yeah, yeah, you have the Civil War, and then you have Reconstruction, and you still have that division, and maybe the 1920s, like you're saying, is we kind of start to see maybe that there's a way out of that. Is that kind of what you're saying?
yeah, kind of a shot in the arm,
Okay.
I would say. Like we would have gotten there eventually, but nothing like conflict to bring countrymen together, even if it's by
Hmm.
force.
Okay. Okay. So we can kind of unite around a common enemy, which would be the Germans. mainly in World War One.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And then when they would come back, the factories and other professions were already in overdrive because of the war effort,
Hmm.
and so these these young men were kind of just plug and play
Hmm.
into a situation where it was already made to succeed,
Okay.
and if that makes sense. And since the war had dragged on for so long and was so grueling and so taxing on all the other world powers of that time, there was a power vacuum.
Mm.
And partially because America just became united again and we weren't in it for that long, we didn't have to use a lot of our own resources, our manpowers in the fight. It was kind of a perfect storm. Um, all the points of light coming together, and the United States was just in a perfect position to take advantage of it.
Yes, I would absolutely agree. In fact, I think this is when the United States really becomes an economic superpower, is after World War One. We've always been like, we're always kind of a sleeping giant, of course. We always had that potential, but it seems like after World War One and you hit into the 20s, we really start to hit that potential. Now, not militarily, okay? It was still military. I mean, even before World War Two, we had like a smaller army than Romania. So again, militarily, we're not as quite ambitious at this time, but economically, I do think you see the United States really just explode after World War One. So that, you mentioned the factories, how long and grueling the war was. Well, the United States was supplying, like giving supplies, and so our factories were humming even though we didn't have troops in the war. We were still very much, we were neutral, of course, but we were still, our factories were pumping out materials and supplies to send overseas over there, as the song goes. So we like you said, it was a shot in the arm. I really like that phrase. World War One was for our economy. And then we never really looked back until the Great Depression, which, funny enough, how do we get out of the Great Depression? Another shot in the arm with World War Two. But we will get to that probably in another podcast. So let's kind of talk about one thing we were talking about before the podcast, is the assembly line and how that truly just revolutionizes the way products are made at a mass scale. And when products are made at a mass scale, then what happens to the price? Well, it does go down. And so Americans can actually afford to buy stuff. And you do see wages go up. It's not great to be a worker in America at this time. It's not, the unions are still fighting for better working conditions, but you do start to see slow improvement, especially if you compare it to like the early 1900s, late 1800s, kind of that Gilded Age again, where the inside of these cities are just kind of cesspools. But so when you have mass production of goods, you have consumerism. And Carl, did you find much about kind of the consumerism in America at this time?
Um, what I found about the consumerism age was a lot of it was driven by the radio
Okay.
as well, because then you were able to reach a massive part of the population at once. And so advertisement becomes huge.
Mhm.
And so for the first time, people are not only seeing these ads from the newspapers, but now they're also listening to them. And then they can hear how excited people are about these different products. And so that also really drove consumerism up and the amount of leisure time that people had.
Yes. The radio, that's such a great point. And that's one thing I tell my students. I mean, people used to gather around the radio, right? Wasn't the TV, obviously. It wasn't, oh, let's gather around and read a book. I mean, the radio really becomes such a central part of American culture. In fact, when the War of the Worlds came out, that book, right, they would read it over the air and people thought it was a real event. I mean, they thought aliens were actually attacking. So that just shows the power of what they heard over the radio. And so, yeah, you hear advertisements over the radio. And guess what? Now in the Roaring Twenties, you've got credit. You don't even actually have to afford what you want to buy. So that new vacuum cleaner, which to Americans are like, vacuum cleaner, what? I got that for $60 at Walmart. Who, like, what's so special about vacuum cleaner? Well, that shortens your work time so much, especially if you're the wife of the home or the mother of the home. And like you said, Americans are getting things that give them leisure time. Did you find much about like what they're doing with their leisure time? I mean, the dollar is also, let's talk kind of about the strength of the dollar during this time as well. So wages are going up a little bit, slowly but surely. You have more products. Products are becoming cheaper because they're being able to mass produce because of the assembly line, especially the vehicle. The vehicle's huge, or the automobile. Talk about a revolution in American cultural history is the automobile, which really becomes mass produced during this time. But I know you just did some awesome research over kind of the power of the dollar during this time and stuff like that. So why don't you just tell our listeners about it?
Yeah, so I found that now this is all average when you're talking about the economy over a near decade period. It's really hard to nail down,
Right.
you know,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
and condense it all. So just for the sake of time, a lot of this is going to be generalities and
Right.
averages. But in the 20s, $1 back then was equal to about 16.50 today. And average salary at the beginning was about $3,000. Towards the
Okay.
end, different professions started to earn more, and you really started to see the diversion.
Okay.
And
Okay.
different states, you really saw also a steep difference.
Right. Right.
But at the start of the 20s, when things started to kick off, it was about $3,000.
Okay.
But I did find a couple of years where the U.S. economy, the dollar actually experienced deflation instead of inflation.
Okay.
And so as the 20s went on, your dollar was worth more. You were able to buy more with the same amount of money, not just because of goods cheapening, but because it was just worth more. Your dollar was
Okay.
sometimes to the tune of double digits a year.
Oh wow. And like deflation.
Yeah, some huge numbers.
Okay.
Um, but I found that the price differences back then, the necessities were, or I should say, like the bigger ticket items were less expensive. But some of the more common everyday items were more expensive than I expected.
Okay.
So, like for example, an average house back then, like a 2 bed, 3 bed, 1 bath, was about $95,000.
Okay.
And a car was about $8,000. Brand spanking new, right off the lot. It still has the fresh car smell.
Wow.
But eggs was $7 a dozen, and gas was about $4 a gallon. And so I didn't expect like common everyday items like that to be more expensive, or even
Right.
just around our prices today.
Right. You
Um,
expect everything to be cheaper.
yeah, I mean, that would just be kind of common knowledge. But rent, I found, took up about 20% of the average salary back then, whereas today it takes up at least 30 on average, and in some states 40% of an average paycheck.
Okay. Okay. So huge difference there. I mean, housing, yeah, there's no question about it, how much cheaper and how much more buying power you had with housing and rent back in the 1920s is, 100 years later today.
Yeah, Yeah, it was just, and things were getting cheaper year over year, and like you said, especially the vehicle, the car.
Right, right. Yes, and that's, yeah, the vehicle is something I want to talk about, because I just think you can't really talk about the Roaring Twenties without talking about the automobile. So Ford comes out with the assembly line and completely revolutionizes how vehicles are made. Before the, because the automobile isn't necessarily just a 1920s invention. The automobile had been around, I think, for even maybe, you know, 10 years, a decade, or a little bit more. But what Henry Ford is able to do with the assembly line in this standard way of building a car, putting one together, it goes from like taking up to 12 hours, guys, to 93 minutes to put together a car. I mean, again, it used to be, before the assembly line, it was an all-day thing. And it goes from that to being, you can pump out a car, like a put together full car every 2 hours. And so Americans can afford to buy the vehicle. And in fact, by 1929, over half of Americans have a vehicle. And when you think of the American life, like the American way of life, especially when you compare it to places like Europe, it is like you got to think of the car, man. The automobile is America's thing. We love vehicles here. We love our fast cars. We love our trucks. And we owe it to the assembly line, Henry Ford, and the workers in the 1920s for really figuring out how to get it done. And so, but with the vehicle, it's not just the automobile that is prospering because of the invention of the assembly line. Next thing you know, you need mechanics, right? You got a bunch of cars on the road. People need to fix it. So guess what? That's another job opportunity. You're going cross country on on a highway? Yeah, you're gonna need a place to stay. You're going from Missouri to California. Yeah, you're probably going to want to stop there. Well, guess what? I got a motel for you. And guess what? My motel employs maids and workers and maintenance workers. Oh, you want to stop at White Castle? Yeah, this thing called fast food. Yeah, you drive on up. Yeah, you get your new car that you just bought, drive on up, grab a hamburger, and guess what? Now with my White Castle, I've employed a bunch of different people from, like, well, maybe not a bunch, okay? It is still fast food. So it's not like you have servers necessarily. But the point I'm trying to make is that the automobile in the 1920s, it's not just the assembly line and the factory workers and the consumer that are benefiting, right? You don't have to own a vehicle to benefit from it. You can be an owner of a motel, and you can ride your horse to work every day and still benefit from the automobile because people start to drive. Americans love that freedom, and
This is one of those, instead of taking a pebble and throwing it into the lake of the American economy, you're throwing a whole boulder.
Right. Absolutely. And the ripple effects of the automobile are you just can't talk about the 1920s without talking about the automobile. Now there are some downsides, well, or good side, depending on how you look at it. There's a quote from, I think maybe it's an author during the 1920s, but he calls them brothel on wheels, because Americans realize that they have this thing that gives them actually quite a bit of privacy, and they don't need to hitch up a horse. They can just hop in with their girlfriend or whoever and just drive off somewhere with full privacy, and people are going to do what people do. And so I'm sure the first car makeout session was somewhere in the early 1920s. I just have a feeling. But
can we do this?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, at one point there was someone for the first time made out in a vehicle, and they have no idea what they started.
They have no idea the trend.
Yes. Yes. But to me, to be honest, Carl, the 1920s, like the economy, I think you have to hit the economy. And that's not to say everybody was just booming, right? Like farmers were kind of struggling during the 1920s because Europe didn't need their wheat or whatever, like crops they were producing. So not everybody is being super, super successful during the 1920s. And that is something we obviously keep in mind. But I think really with the 1920s, what I'm the most fascinated with, other than maybe the automobile, but this includes that, is kind of just these cultural shifts in the United States. I absolutely think that's fascinating. You have jazz music becomes very popular. Obviously, we have the prohibition. I mean, that's a whole nother topic. So why don't we talk about let's talk about the prohibition a little bit, because that's just one of those big things you got to talk about when you talk about the 1920s.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing about Henry Ford.
He hated Jews.
Yeah,
Yeah,
he pretty
yeah,
massively.
yeah. Him and Tucker Carlson would be tight.
Yes, very. Um, but there's a reporter in the mid 1920s where Henry Ford was also kind of known as being pretty arrogant,
Okay.
and he just would not like field questions, and he would not like do surveys or anything like that. And so a reporter was like, "Why don't you ever care what the customer says? Why don't you ever ask them what they think, what they want, and all this sort of stuff?" And Henry Ford looks at him and says, "Because the customer doesn't know what they want. If I asked them what they wanted, they would have said they wanted a faster horse."
I love that quote, dude. That is so good. That is, God, that quote just defines American, like, in capitalism and laissez-faire capitalism that of that period, dude. You do have, I mean, again, maybe we can't quite jump away from the economy. I mean, maybe we should talk about some of the products that come out when you think of these new inventions that, yeah, like the American consumer, like, it's not that they were asking for it, but like vacuum cleaners and washing machines,
Refrigerators.
refrigerators. I mean, and again, people can buy this stuff on credit. And so, which does obviously help lead to the Great Depression down the road. But Americans can buy stuff, like true stuff. And women actually can start to have a little bit of leisure time. You don't have to spend all day cleaning if you're a woman in the home, which is still what a
Well,
majority of the women were doing.
and you don't have to make a fresh meal every day either.
Right,
You can all of a sudden you have the option to have leftovers for
right.
multiple days.
Yeah, you
They
can
probably
meal
thought it
prep.
was witchcraft.
Yeah, yeah, they probably thought it was witchcraft. What do you mean, woman?
What?
We just ate this yesterday. There's no way
You
it's
mean
good.
you mean I can make this biscuit and soup on Monday and we can eat it still on Thursday?
Yeah, yeah, I know. It's and you see this explosion. Like, I bet in 1915 nobody's talking about refrigerators. I mean, let me fact check myself. When did the refrigerator come out, for example? When did the first refrigerator come out? If I can spell refrigerator come out. Okay, so domestic home refrigerators were introduced in 1913 with mass production starting around 1920. So again, there's that mass production. Why? Because we can produce them a lot faster probably because of the assembly line. So the refrigerator goes from probably being a luxury to being like an actual standard item by the mid 1920s.
Well, and I think the biggest reason, uh, honestly, by a long shot, of why the 20s we saw such a massive leap forward was finally being able to harness electricity.
Oh
Uh,
yeah,
because for the first time in world history, we had a power source that was steady, it was predictable, and it was adjustable. And so we can fine tune it to do whatever we wanted. And
right,
it was constant. You didn't have to rely on your own physical power or even like the physical power and determination of an animal like a
right.
horse or an ox. You finally had something else that was inanimate that could
Right.
do it for you.
Yeah,
And
dude, I'm
that
so glad you brought
allowed
it.
all of these other inventions to finally work
Right.
and to have the longevity, because yeah, sure, we could refrigerate things in an ice house, but that was only if you had ice available.
Right.
Now you could have a permanent ice
Right.
box
Right.
ice house for forever if you wanted it.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, man, that's that you cannot. Again, it's like the automobile. Yeah, electricity is a huge thing in the 1920s. And again, it's not that everybody has it, of course not, but it starts to become solely a luxury item for the rich, 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 to maybe it's trickling down to the middle class. And that middle class worker can actually afford to buy a home, maybe get some electricity, and use some of these new inventions, because a lot of these inventions do require to be plugged in. So that shows Americans had access to electricity because these products are selling into homes that have electricity to so they can actually use them.
I
So,
found that in 1912, an estimated 16% of American households had working electricity, but in the mid 20s, more than 60% did.
oh yeah, so over half in like 10, 12 years, it jumps like over doubles the amount. Actually, over like quadruples the amount of Americans have electricity. And
Yeah.
indoor plumbing is becoming, again, from just a true luxury item for the rich, rich, down to trickling down to the middle class. So really, America, I guess, yeah, I'm glad we kind of stuck on the economy and stuff like that instead of jumping to the cultural. Because, yeah, I'm really glad we're kind of stayed on this topic a little bit, because when you think of like America, like modern America being born, it's the 1920s without question. I mean, there's so much that we can recognize from. Like, you could actually go back to the 1920s. Like, I could take one of my students, plop them back in 1925, and even they would not be incredibly lost, in the sense that they would see things that were familiar, right? They would see vehicles. They know what a radio is. They obviously know they would know what electricity is, vacuums, washing machines, all that stuff, refrigerators. So again, I think when we think of modern America being born, it is the 1920s, I think, for sure, the Roaring Twenties, which gives it its name, right? I mean, it just is a roaring time in the sense that, again, not everything's perfect. We could spend a lot of time talking about the bad of the Roaring Twenties, because there definitely was. Again, labor unions are still having to fight. They're sometimes still being like attacked for unionizing and going on strike because working conditions are not that great. But when you think of the economy taking off and just the consumerism of America really being born, yeah, it's the 1920s for sure.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So is
And
there
like you
anything
said, you could take a modern person and they would still recognize stuff.
right?
They could still operate. Is pretty spectacular.
Yeah, absolutely. We've built on so much from the 1920s, without question. So now I feel like this. Do you agree? This is probably a better time to shift to the cultural
Yeah, let's
aspect
do
of the
it.
1920s. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and start with Prohibition. When you think of American culture in 1920s, you got to talk about the Prohibition. But you can't talk about the Prohibition without talking about the temperance movement that had been growing in America for a long time before, mainly led by women, because when women are the ones, when the man comes home drunk, they're going to face the consequences of that. Very much targeted at immigrants, especially from Germany and Ireland, I think. Those were, when you think of the temperance movement, again, led by women, really hitting hard these immigrants. But gains enough traction where the prohibition happens. I think, can't remember. Do you remember what amendment it was? I should know. I think it's not the 20. Is it what? Which amendment
It
is?
was the 18th, I think.
Yeah. Yep. 18th Amendment. Yep. So it was ratified in 1919. Goes into effect on January 17th, 1920. And it wasn't repealed until 1933 during the Great Depression, because I'm sure FDR was like, you know what, people, like, you know what, I'll give you this. Like, we got to at least give them this. Let them at least drown their sorrows.
They can't afford a
Legally.
steak. At least
Yes.
let the man have a beer.
Yes, after work, if he's working. so,
Yeah.
so yeah, prohibition. But Carl, does the prohibition stop Americans? Okay, It's like
Doesn't stop him. No.
no,
Come on.
Americans are like Michael Scott when Pam says, "Can you stop dating my mom?" and he says, "I'm going to date her even harder." You tell Americans to not do something, we're going to do it even harder. And I'll tell you
Yeah.
what, we partied harder in the 1920s than we did in 1910. I don't have any empirical data to back that up, really, but I'm just going to say it because I know it's
Purely speculative.
right. Like we got to talk about the what happened. So, Carl, what is a speakeasy? Talk about speakeasy a little bit.
Basically, it's a secret club that they still sold liquor. Usually it was in the basement or in the back room.
Right.
But from what I found, it was one of those, hey, no one, no one should know about this.
Yeah.
And the cops will totally arrest you
Yeah.
if they find out, kind of a deal. I'm sure, of course, there was cops that were completely hardcore and were
Mhm.
like, I don't care what the law says, this is the law, and by
Right.
golly, I'm gonna follow it.
Right.
But from my research, most everybody was just like, the guys were kind of like, God, the women did that. That's kind of cute. Anyway, come to my back shed. Let's have some moonshine.
Yeah. Hey, I got some bathtub gin.
Yeah,
How
that's
cool.
real cute.
Can you
That's real
imagine
cute of
how,
you, honey.
yeah, can you imagine
Anyway,
how disgusting that shit was?
just
Bathtub gin.
terrible.
Actually, did you know alcohol related deaths did go up during the 1920s?
Yeah,
Overall,
none of it
it did.
was regulated.
Yes, exactly. Because alcohol consumption actually did drop, I'm pretty sure, during the night. It did. The prohibition worked in the sense that alcohol consumption overall did drop. Because when it's illegal to have, sell, make, drink, it will drop. But Americans, they just want it even more, though. There's just more of that urge, I think, to have
Well,
it.
yeah, because now you're like, you're getting away with something.
Right, exactly. And
And all of a
Americans
sudden
love
it
that.
becomes like a little heart racer, Oh, ooh, we
Yes.
shouldn't be doing this right now.
Right, right. And so, and with that, women are actually getting out and they're showing a little ankle and they're showing a little knee and they're going out and dancing.
They're getting
And they're,
crazy.
yes, and they're actually just kind of hanging out with men, the flapper girls, which, they're cutting their hair short. They're voting. They really have, again, you can have your opinions on this, whether, this kind of
Yeah.
liberation of movement for women is good or bad. But the reality is it happened. And women, they do have, I guess you could say, more freedoms and more liberation. And they're able to do more in the 1920s. And so I think if you hop down into a speakeasy in 1920s in Chicago, is it going to be like the Great Gatsby like party? I think the movie. No, not that. But I think it wouldn't be shocking to see like women and men maybe dancing, hanging out, drinking, something you would see in a like kind of your local bar, right? Today, I'm sure things are way worse today just because our culture's crap overall. But I just don't think it would be. I just don't think again if I was plopped into a speakeasy in 1925, I don't think it would be that much different. I guess other than of
No,
course the fact that it's in secret and you got to be sneaky about it. But yeah, they start to dance. What was it? What was the famous dance? Man, I should remember this stuff. Did you find that? What was the famous dance in the 1920s?
um,
It was a
no, I
Charles.
didn't.
It
The
was the
Charles,
Charles.
yes,
Yes.
yes,
I mean, girl, it's like they're kicking their heels, they're swinging their arms. I mean, they're
just a
listening to
whole
jazz
bunch of
music.
hooligans.
Yeah, man, just tomfoolery everywhere.
I'm sure and at this time, like women are starting to go to college more, they're holding down
Right.
jobs, even as
Yes.
single women. I'm sure all the old people were just losing their marbles.
I know, I know. I have to agree. I think it would truly be a shock to so many of the older Americans. What do you mean you're single in 24? Wait, you
You're
have your
single
own
at
job?
19?
Yeah, you're single at 19. You don't have a kid yet?
Well, and at that time, they'd probably be like, "Hey, I have a 45-year-old cousin you should meet."
Yeah. Yeah. So, and again, I generally think that's good. Again, have we gone too far in today's society? Yeah, probably. But I look at that as a good thing, that there is a little bit of choice in the lives of women at this time. Again, if because there's nothing stopping if they want that traditional life, but if they do maybe want to be single, they were getting jobs like again, these are women jobs like secretaries, nurses, teachers, but they could actually kind of support themselves. They didn't need to just be tied to a man to live. Now, again, let's just look up, because we're on this conversation. I don't have all this on the top of my head, but like, what was the average age of marriage in 1925? So it would have been around 24, 25 years old for men and about 20 to 21 to 22 for women.
It's actually not too far off from today.
No, that isn't. That isn't. So that is interesting. So
Still, it's a lot of fun to try and poke fun at people way back then.
right. Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, anyways, but kind of back to more of the prohibition. Yeah, Americans are still drinking. That's why, we have the rise of the mafia, because these gangs go from kind of petty, not super organized, to all of a sudden there's a market for bootlegged alcohol. There's a market for homemade alcohol, and it takes a level of organization. You gotta find a property to make it where the cops aren't going to be sniffing around or the feds, whoever. You have to then transport it, right? You got to sell it to a speakeasy or an undercover bar. So that takes a level of organization that kind of creates this idea of the mob or the mafia or organized crime. So do you have anything else to add on that?
In my research, I didn't delve into that too much. I mostly personally focused on like the economy and why that got bolstered up. But I do know, obviously everyone knows Al Capone,
Right.
which,
Right.
full disclosure, up until like 6 years ago, I just assumed that he was from New York
Right. Right. Where is he actually
and
from?
not Chicago.
Yeah, he's Chicago. Have you heard of the song "The Night Chicago Died"? All of our listeners
Hmm.
should listen to it. It's a solid song. I'm pretty sure that's from this time period, between the fighting between the cops and Al Capone's men.
And I'm sure you'll get into this at the end. Just for what he actually went to jail for was
Right.
just
Yeah. Pay your
crazy.
taxes, kids.
Yeah.
Pay your taxes. It'll bite you in the butt. It will.
I mean, he found a way to get away with literally every other infraction in the book.
I know, except for paying
But
his
you don't give Uncle Sam your dimes,
yes.
he'll
Yeah.
get you.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. So yeah, which the this idea of the mobster and stuff that goes until I mean the 70s, 80s. So it's a very from the 20s to the 70s, 80s, and even up to the 90s. I think The Sopranos, which is it's a very popular TV show about the mob. I think like that's even pushing into the 90s. So we're talking up to 70 years of mafia and mob being a pretty big part of American life in some of these cities. And again, you got to trace it back to the prohibition, because when they realize they're really good at this alcohol thing and they're pretty organized, then they get into everything else, right? Gambling, prostitution, drugs, probably money laundering, right? So again, that was probably the most fascinating thing for me with the 1920s doing the research, is the connection between the mafia and the prohibition, for sure. So yeah, so then kind of in this culture, I think, I think we also need to talk about, kind of the elephant in the room is the fact that you still have racial segregation and discrimination during the 1920s. Again, the Roaring Twenties. As an American, we have to be brutally honest with ourselves, and we're saying Roaring Twenties for who, right? And it wasn't exactly for Black Americans. Now, there is some positive shifts though with that. You have the Great Migration, where you have African Americans. They're moving up to the northern cities for a variety of reasons, to escape racism, for better jobs, so on and so forth. And then you have in Harlem, New York City, you have the Harlem Renaissance, which I love learning about the Harlem Renaissance. Carl, do you know anything about that? I mean,
Just in the articles that I read about the economy, it did say that the Roaring Twenties was roaring for the people that could afford it, and a lot of the times, unfortunately, that was not black people at this time.
right, right,
But it did say that even blacks, natives, Mexicans, immigrants of all kinds also did see a rise in their economic growth, just not as rapidly as white Americans did.
right, right. You know, we're without still about 30, 40 years out from the civil rights kind of movement as we would think about it with MLK. But African Americans, in the Harlem Renaissance, they kind of start to take their culture back. You know, they go from, look, I mean, at this point, probably even just grandparents, all they ever knew was slavery, right? All they ever knew was Reconstruction, right? Jim Crow, all that. So up in New York City, they start to create their own art, their own music, their own poems. Then they start to create their own culture, which I think it's really, really cool what they did. And in fact, Langston Hughes is a very famous poet, and he's a poet from from this Harlem Renaissance. And I want to tell this or say this poem to our listeners here. It's called "I Too," and I think it just summarizes the kind of the black experience at this time for America. So it says, "I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody will dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America." Oh, that's my favorite poem from Langston Hughes. And I just love that there's hope in it, you know? There's hope in that poem. So we can't, you know, he's got a lot of poems. And so I encourage the listeners to just look them up and read them, you know, and look up some Harlem Renaissance art and really dive into that. Cause I think it's really, really fascinating. So kind of the last thing, I guess, with culture before we run out of time here, is that I want to talk about is sports, because we love sports in America. So fun fact I actually learned today was that baseball, before kind of the Roaring 20s, 1920s, was actually on the decline, because there was this scandal where I think it was some White Sox players threw the World Series. And it isn't until Babe Ruth comes around, he kind of reignites that love of baseball for Americans. But do you know what the other most popular sport was during the 1920s? Take a guess.
Probably something that we today would think of as boring, like rowing.
No, it was boxing.
Boxing? Oh, I could see that
Yeah.
too.
Boxing was really, really popular in the 1920s. But again, we kind of talk about that leisure time, right? Americans, they actually might have a little time now to really pay attention to sports. And so from the 1920s on, sports in America, it only becomes more popular. But I found that really interesting that baseball and boxing were the two most popular sports in the 1920s.
Well, and also, I mean, we've kind of already said it, but the radio
Right.
massively
Back to
would have
that.
impacted sports, because now all of a sudden, if you're a New York Yankees fan, you're not getting, even if you're not a fan of the New York Yankees and you live in Topeka, Kansas, you're still hearing about Babe Ruth on the radio.
Right.
And what he's doing. You know his name. You know what he looks like. And now cameras are like video cameras are like just starting. And so you see who he is. You find you can the idea of the celebrity is really born at this time too. And I feel like Babe Ruth really was a encapsulation of what America thought of itself
Okay.
at
I
this
like that.
time. Like kind of cocky,
Right.
kind of the best at what he did, and just kind of did his thing, and he was the best at it. And then was if you challenged him, he was very firm. It was like, nope, I'm the
Right.
best.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Because if you look at him, he's actually like looks like one of the more unathletic dudes I've ever seen in my life. But the man could swing a bat,
Yeah.
and that's what Americans wanted at the time. They wanted a dude who could swing the bat. So yeah, that's so. Again, we try to keep it. We're got a few more minutes here. Is there anything else from the Roaring Twenties you wanna kind of hit on? There's a few more things I would like to just maybe briefly discuss if you've got nothing. But anything else you find in your research?
Not that I dove in deep enough to really feel comfortable talking about.
Okay. Well, I did want to talk about education as a teacher. I've always been fascinated, like when did kind of public school system really become into existence? And I think Mississippi was like the last state to mandate public education. I think it was in 1918. So by the 1920s, you have again kind of like you could plop a student down today, and it's like, oh yeah, you're gonna have to go to school. They may learn a little bit different subjects, but I think by the 1920s you start to have more and more kids are going to school. And fun fact, the summer break has nothing really to do with agriculture. It has everything to do with in these urban cities, they needed to get out of the sweltering grossness. And so the summer break wasn't because the farmers needed help on the farms. It had more to do with the urban areas where these more wealthy families would go out to the country during the summer to get away from the heat and the oppressive. Just you can imagine these cities, still aren't super clean by any means. Even today, like you're in New York City and it's like 95 degrees out. You're in Chicago and it's just hot as heck out. You don't want to be there. It's concrete jungle. And so that's just kind of a quick fun fact about summer break. But one, again, again, not everything was great during the Roaring Twenties. You still had I think I saw a statistic that 1 million kids were still in like child labor, which is a lot. That's a lot of children between 10 and 15 that are not going to school and they're still got to work because the federal government doesn't really start to cramp down on child labor until like 1938 or something like that. So yeah, so that I just kind of wanted to hit on those points. Couldn't really think of a great place until maybe the end to talk about that. But yeah, so man, I think we've hit everything we wanted to talk about in the Roaring Twenties. Again, we can maybe make this into a part 2. We can definitely kind of go back and revisit some of these themes. But I think we did a pretty good job of just giving our listeners kind of an overview of the 1920s. And again, we hope through our podcast that you get interested in this stuff. We aren't experts. We don't claim to be experts, but what we hope to do is spark a little curiosity in our listeners and a little appreciation for our history. So again, thank you guys very much for listening and supporting us. We ask that you just like, share, and subscribe. And we'll see you next time. I don't know, Carl, do you want to kind of stick with American history, or what are you thinking?
Man, it's so wide open.
I know. I love it.
History, the world is our oyster.
Hell
We
yeah,
can
dude.
pick anything we want.
Man, I think we got to start a Civil War series. I'm just freaking just so ready to talk about the Civil War. But we'll figure it out. So, we will always, like, if we have anybody say any topic in our comments, we will always do that without question. So if you're listening to this and you actually have something you'd like for us to talk about, put it in the comment section. I promise we'll do it. So, all right. We'll see you next time. I'm Gabriel.
I'm Carl.
And this is History Unscripted.